There are moments in Hollywood's long and tangled history where the cameras didn't simply capture a scene, they reacted to it. Moments when a film set built with wires, gels, lights, and analog machinery began behaving as if something else were sharing the room, something that did not belong to the production crew. Tonight's dossier opens with a truth most studios refuse to put on record. During the shooting of several classic sci-fi films, unexplained technical failures struck with such precision, repetition, and intent that even seasoned engineers were left speechless. These weren't the usual glitches caused by humidity, loose cables, or magnetic interference. What we're looking at are anomalies that manifested only during certain scenes, usually the scenes dealing with danger, forbidden knowledge, or encounters that pushed past human understanding. Cameras froze mid-take, while their power meters showed full charge. Reels developed ghostly overlays that were not in any neighboring frame. Boom microphones picked up faint whispers, radio-like bursts, or tones outside the spectrum of any on-set equipment. And in a few cases, the footage corrupted itself at the exact moment an actor referenced something not meant to be filmed. Some directors swore the problems, followed them from location to location, as if the interference were tracking the shot list. Others were advised quietly to avoid discussing the events publicly because no technical explanation could protect the studio from speculation. This episode compiles 15 of the most unsettling case files, films whose production phases were marked by disturbances no technician could rationalize. Whether the cause was electromagnetic anomalies, miswired circuitry, or something far stranger hiding between frames, these events left traces that still puzzle archivists today. Open the vault, rewind the tape, listen closely to the static, because sometimes the interference isn't just noise. End Star Wars: A New Hope, 1977. Long before Star Wars became a cultural phenomenon, its production wrestled with failures that even Lucasfilm's engineers struggled to rationalize. The desert of Tunisia was harsh but predictable, yet several film magazines jammed only during scenes involving the Force or moments hinting at unseen cosmic influence. The jams were brief, inexplicable, and never replicated during equipment testing. More perplexing were the failures on the Death Star interior sets. The reflective corridors were lined with practical lights, all running on independent circuits. Yet during takes where Vader appeared, the lights subtly dimmed in a descending sequence, almost as if responding to his entrance. Electricians reviewed every power source and found no correlation that could produce such synchronized dimming. The optical printers used for lightsaber effects behaved unpredictably as well. During some composite shots, the printer introduced faint halos around the blades, halos that didn't match the programmed exposure. These halos vanished when the same shots were reprinted days later, leaving no way to trace their origin. Audio interference became its own enigma. While recording dialogue inside the Millennium Falcon cockpit set, microphones captured a low tremor beneath the actors' voices. The tremor possessed a harmonic pattern, rising and falling like distant machinery. When mixers attempted to isolate it, the tremor disappeared only to re-emerge when the footage referenced the Force. Lucas rarely spoke about the disturbances, but internal memos describe a recurring phrase among the crew: "The film doesn't like being touched." Watching the archives today, one notices anomalies too precise to be random minute distortions that emerge exactly when the story invokes something larger, older, or infinite. If interference has intent, then A New Hope may have been the first film to record it flickering quietly through the machinery that tried to capture a galaxy far, far away. 2. Predator, 1987. The jungles of Mexico were supposed to provide atmospheric isolation for Predator. But the isolation came with consequences no one could account for. The thermal vision sequences, shot with early infrared cameras, repeatedly malfunctioned when aimed at actors portraying the alien hunter's unseen presence. The cameras flickered, produced false heat signatures, or displayed temperature gradients that didn't correspond to the environment. Engineers recalibrated the sensors, replaced power packs, and even swapped entire units. But the glitches resurfaced only when tracking the invisible creature. Steadicam operators encountered an equally baffling issue. While moving through the dense foliage, their equipment occasionally froze mid-motion, as if held in place by a magnetic force. When the footage was reviewed, micro-warps appeared tiny stretches in the frame that made the jungle seem to bend around the characters. These anomalies did not correspond to lens, distortion, or equipment shake. They resembled spatial compression. Audio problems compounded the strangeness. During scenes where the creature mimics human speech, the microphones captured fragments of dialogue from earlier, takes echoes of lines that had already been recorded, playing back out of sequence. This wasn't bleed-through, it was temporal misalignment, a phenomenon sound engineers had never encountered. Even the environment responded oddly. Several shots captured abrupt drops in ambient noise, as if the jungle itself were holding its breath. These moments aligned uncannily with scenes where the characters sensed they were being watched. McTiernan dismissed the anomalies as jungle humidity and unstable power supplies. Yet patterns emerged. The glitches occurred only when the narrative suggested the presence of something not bound by the laws of physics. The interference did more than distort the footage, it mirrored the creature's nature, leaving behind traces that suggested the camera had briefly glimpsed a reality not entirely its own. 3. Blade Runner 1982. Ridley Scott built Blade Runner as a world of fractured memories and unstable identities, and strangely, the shoot itself began reflecting those same fractures. The neon-soaked Los Angeles streets were powered by an enormous lighting grid, but the grid developed irregular pulses whenever scenes focused on replicant identity tests or existential monologues. These pulses weren't brownouts or overvoltage. They behaved like breath, flickering softly, then stabilizing the moment the camera cut away. Video assist systems faced the most disturbing interference. Operators complained that certain takes showed faint double images, ghost silhouettes, that lingered half a second behind the actors' movements, especially during Voight camp sequences. These silhouettes did not appear on film, only on live monitors, and technicians were unable to trace the source. For a production built on questions of humanity and replication, the presence of echoes felt unnervingly thematic. Sound was no safer. During rooftop chase sequences, lavalier microphones captured a thin whine in the upper frequencies. When slowed down, the whine resembled a rising chord, artificial, deliberate, almost computational. Such a pattern shouldn't have existed in an analog environment, and audio engineers swore it wasn't caused by radio interference. Most unsettling of all were the anomalies inside the Bradbury building. The location's iron staircases and old elevator shafts acted like unintended resonators, generating fluctuations in the camera's exposure readings. Even with stable lighting, the meter drifted by several stops, as if sensing a presence that absorbed light differently. When the crew moved to a different location, the readings normalized instantly. Scott later admitted the film felt alive in its own way, a cryptic statement he refused to elaborate on. Watching the raw footage today, archivists note patterns, faint distortions that appear exactly when the story confronts the boundaries between real and artificial. It is as if Blade Runner didn't just explore the question of what it means to be human. It documented something trying to answer back. 4. The Terminator 1984. James Cameron's The Terminator was shot on a modest budget, yet the production encountered disruptions that felt uncannily appropriate for a film about a machine manipulating reality. During nighttime sequences, particularly those involving the Terminator's pursuit, the streetlights on location dimmed or flickered in ways the city's electrical department couldn't explain. These fluctuations appeared only while cameras were rolling, never during setup or rehearsal. Electricians, baffled, reported perfect grounding and power continuity. More alarming were the camera malfunctions. In several chase scenes, the Panavision cameras briefly overcranked recording at higher frame rates without operator input. This created slow-motion effects that weren't noticed until reviewing dailies. The cameras showed no mechanical defects, and tests performed immediately afterward showed perfect stability. The anomalies occurred only during scenes depicting the Terminator's relentless advancement. Audio interference added a deeper layer of unease. Dialogue tracks captured faint metallic clicks and servo-like whirs, even when filming in open, quiet environments. These noises didn't correspond to any of the practical robotic sound effects or camera movements. Technicians attempted to isolate the frequency, but the interference appeared only between spoken lines, almost as if something were listening for pauses. Perhaps the most puzzling glitch occurred during a scene where Sarah Connor hides in the Tech Noir Club. Several frames were corrupted by horizontal lines similar to VHS tracking errors impossible on film cameras. The lines appeared only in the seconds before the Terminator enters frame, as though his presence distorted the recording medium itself. Cameron brushed off the incidents publicly, but crew notes reveal a different story. They repeatedly logged malfunctions timed so precisely to the narrative beats that coincidence seemed unlikely. The disruptions weren't random. They behaved almost like system messages, brief warnings embedded into the film, flickering just beneath the surface of its reality. 5. Alien 1979. Ridley Scott's Alien was a triumph of design and atmosphere, but beneath the crafted terror lay a chain of disruptions that plagued its most iconic moments. The Nostromo's dark corridors were lined with sensors, monitors, and practical lighting, all meticulously coordinated. Yet whenever scenes involving the xenomorph's presence were filmed, the onboard monitors displayed random code strings, nonsense symbols that didn't appear during rehearsals. Engineers rebooted the entire system, replaced cabling, and even swapped monitors. But the patterns returned exactly when the script shifted toward themes of contamination or predation. The ship's ventilation tunnels became a hotspot for glitches. Infrared sensors used to detect airflow helpful during smoke effects malfunctioned repeatedly in these sequences, flashing warnings that indicated phantom temperature spikes. The spikes never manifested in the physical environment, and when technicians attempted diagnostics, the sensors stabilized instantly. Even the creature suit seemed to attract interference. During several takes, the camera feed experienced micro-distortions, tiny ripples across the frame that appeared only when the xenomorph actor moved in low light. The effect didn't resemble standard video noise. It looked like a faint imprint, as though a second, translucent figure passed behind the creature. Laboratory inspection revealed nothing wrong with the film stock. Audio issues were just as disconcerting. When recording Dallas's crawl through the air ducts, the boom mic picked up a low growl that did not match any prop or sound effect in use. The sound had no directional signature, leaving mixers convinced it wasn't produced in the physical space. It vanished only after retaking the scene under different blocking. Scott later called these occurrences the film fighting back, a half-joke masking a real pattern. The interference mirrored the alien itself, unseen, untraceable, and always lurking just off frame. 6. The Thing, 1982. There's a particular hostility embedded in John Carpenter's The Thing, and that hostility seemed to seep into the production itself. The Antarctic research station set built on a refrigerated soundstage was notorious for disrupting electronic equipment. Cameras froze even when their temperature thresholds weren't breached. Film jams occurred in multiple takes, and light meters flickered as though the electricity running through them was being siphoned by something unseen. The malfunctions clustered around scenes featuring the creature's transformations, as if the environment bristled whenever the narrative touched on biological imitation. One of the most baffling incidents occurred during the blood test scene. As the crew prepared for a close-up of the blood sample, the camera's internal shutter timing went off-sync by a fraction of a second, creating a stutter effect that ruined the take. When they reshot the scene hours later, under identical conditions, the shutter malfunction occurred again, only during the moment referencing "Who's Not Human?" Technicians later reviewed the camera's mechanics and found no defects. The device worked flawlessly for the rest of the production. Sound recording proved equally treacherous. Several takes captured subtle, irregular thumps beneath the dialogue, too slow to be machinery, too rhythmic to be random noise. When analyzed, the thumps resembled a distorted heartbeat. Interestingly, the pattern's tempo shifted depending on which character was in frame, as if mimicking the tension of the scene. The crew chalked it up to atmospheric interference from the cold, yet similar cold-stage productions never experienced these anomalies. Carpenter refused to entertain paranormal explanations, but he later admitted that The Thing had an atmosphere that resisted being documented. It wasn't just a story about something hiding inside human skin. The glitches suggested that the film itself was being inhabited by an intelligence unwilling to be captured cleanly, leaving behind electrical scars across the lenses and reels. 7. 2001. A Space Odyssey, 1968. For a film built on precision, the technical disturbances that emerged during 2001's production were shockingly inconsistent with Stanley Kubrick's reputation for control. While building the Discovery 1 interior, the crew encountered inexplicable sensor failures on the rotating centrifuge set. Gyroscopic monitors used to stabilize the massive rotating wheel regularly desynced, displaying readings that suggested the set was tilting or vibrating even when it wasn't moving. Engineers recalibrated the system repeatedly, only for the errors to return precisely during shots where HAL's monitoring systems were active in the script. Film stock, too, became a battlefield. The front projection technique used for the Dawn of Man sequence required mathematically perfect alignment, Yet several takes featured ghost images, double silhouettes that appeared a few frames before actors entered the scene. These weren't reflections or projection misfires. Projectionists confirmed the rig was properly synchronized. The phantom shapes disappeared whenever Kubrick switched to scenes without monolith imagery. Sound recording offered its own perplexities. Hal's calm, clinical voice lines were captured cleanly, but the pre-roll and post-roll segments around those lines often contained faint mechanical clicks, almost like relay switches toggling in a distant server room. No such devices existed on set. Technicians stripped the studio down to its wiring, searching for interference sources, and found none. Even the models behaved strangely. During motion control capture of the Discovery spacecraft, the guidance rails stalled twice at the exact moment Hal decided to sever human control. The stalls didn't appear in diagnostics and never recurred outside those specific shots. Kubrick refused to theorize publicly, but crew memos revealed a shared belief. The film's themes, artificial intelligence, human frailty, cosmic intervention, seemed mirrored in the malfunctions. The interference didn't disrupt 2001. It infused the production with an eerie sense of observation, as if the film's intelligence existed long before Hal ever spoke a word. 8. Close Encounters of the Third Kind, 1977. Steven Spielberg's Close Encounters was shot with military precision, yet the production was repeatedly struck by malfunctions that felt eerily thematic. The most notorious issues surfaced during the scenes involving bright light phenomena. Lighting rigs built to simulate UFO illumination randomly surged, emitting pulses that exceeded their programmed intensity. Electricians described the fluctuations as self-generated because the surge patterns did not match any on-site power irregularity. When the same lights were tested outside the narrative's UFO sequences, they behaved perfectly. Camera teams faced an even stranger problem. During long exposure, shots meant to capture the ethereal glow of unidentified craft. Streaks appeared across the film's smooth, curved trails that didn't match lens flares or reflections. Lab technicians examining the negatives noted that the patterns resembled light, captured from a moving source, yet no such source existed on set. These streaks did not damage the footage. Instead, they added an otherworldly texture that made the crew uneasy. Audio anomalies followed a similar pattern. The signature 5-tone motif was recorded countless times, but several takes captured faint harmonics beneath the melody tones no instrument on set produced. When analyzed spectrally, they appeared as clean, geometric patterns, too precise for accidental noise. The harmonics only appeared during scenes referencing contact or communication. What made these failures especially haunting was their consistency. They responded to the film's thematic beats. Scenes grounded in human drama shot cleanly. Scenes invoking the unknown triggered distortions. Spielberg joked that the production was method acting, but later admitted that the lights and sound behaved with intention. Viewed today, the anomalies don't feel like errors. They feel like a subtle dialogue, a set of signals that flickered into the production, leaving behind traces no one has been able to fully decode. Poltergeist 1982. Poltergeist is usually remembered for the tragedies surrounding its cast, but the lesser-known story lies in the bizarre technical interference that plagued the production. While the film deals with spirits manipulating objects, many of the disturbances behind the camera were far more mechanical, yet no less unnerving. During several effect sequences, the motion control rigs that moved props and cameras began misfiring. Some repeated actions out of sync, others executed commands that had not been programmed. Engineers tore through the control boards, looking for loose fuses or short circuits, and found nothing. The rigs behaved normally until filming resumed on scenes involving communication with the other side. The most unsettling anomalies occurred in the sound department. Boom! Microphones captured whispers layered beneath dialogue, patterns that resembled reverse speech. Playback technicians attempted to isolate the frequencies, but the whispers vanished when examined digitally and reappeared only when played through analog equipment. In several cases, these whispers aligned with narrative beats involving the entity inside the house, as though the film's themes triggered the interference. Even the film stock betrayed signs of contamination, at least on the surface. A handful of frames developed sudden bursts of white specks, not dust or scratches, but pinpoints that looked like miniature star fields. Kodak Labs, after studying the samples, concluded the phenomenon wasn't caused by chemical errors or environmental exposure. To this day, archived prints show the same glittering burst in identical frames. Director Tobe Hooper dismissed most of these anomalies as coincidences, but he admitted years later that some moments felt watched. Crew members described sudden temperature drops around equipment racks, followed by spontaneous audio distortions. Poltergeist's story was fictional, but the interference that slipped onto its reels remains a technical mystery, one that seems to whisper from just beyond the frame. 10. The Abyss, 1989. James Cameron's The Abyss pushed the limits of underwater filmmaking, but the deeper the production went literally and thematically, the more inexplicable the disturbances became. The main underwater tank in South Carolina was engineered to be a closed, controlled environment, yet the crew repeatedly recorded light distortions drifting across the frame like bioluminescent trails. At first, they assumed these were reflections from equipment, but the distortions moved independently of any external light source, tracing slow arcs through black water that behaved less like optics and more like intentional motion. Camera housings suffered from telemetry errors that baffled the operators. Depth and pressure indicators fluctuated despite the tank's stabilized conditions. The anomalies often occurred during scenes involving the alien water, pseudopod, or moments hinting at a non-human intelligence. When filming more conventional sequences, the sensors remained perfectly stable. One incident became infamous among the crew. During a take where Lindsay and Bud descend into the trench, the audio recorder captured a low-frequency hum that oscillated in a rising pattern, almost like a distant engine. Divers confirmed there were no active machines within range. The hum only appeared during that single shot, never before or after, and the tank's acoustics couldn't replicate it. Footage corruption added another layer of mystery. Several reels developed faint, wave-like patterns across the emulsion patterns that lab technicians said resembled water damage. Yet the reels had remained sealed in waterproof canisters the entire time. The corruption, strangely, appeared only in scenes discussing communication with the unknown. Cameron, true to form, insisted on pushing through every malfunction, but even he acknowledged the eerie consistency of the disturbances. "The water has its own personality," he joked, though crew members admitted privately that the interference didn't feel like malfunctions at all. It felt responsive. By the time filming wrapped, The Abyss had accumulated a trail of anomalies that left the archivists convinced of one thing: something in that tank, be it the environment, the equipment, or the story itself, was interacting with the production on its own terms. 11. The Fly, 1986. David Cronenberg's The Fly was a meticulous production, but the technical disturbances surrounding the transformation sequences left even veteran crew members unsettled. The workshop set where Seth Brundle's gradual mutation unfolds was notorious for unexplained light fluctuation. During close-ups of Brundle's deteriorating skin, the key lights dimmed by a few percentage points, too subtle for the naked eye but obvious on the dailies. Electricians tracked the power draw repeatedly and found no irregularities. These dips never occurred during rehearsal, only during actual takes, when the prosthetics and dialogue focused on degeneration or loss of identity. Camera operators reported recurring autofocus drift, despite using manually locked lenses. The image would soften in a way that appeared organic, almost like the frame itself was recoiling from the actor. When checking the equipment afterward, the lenses behaved perfectly. Cronenberg initially suspected heat distortion from the prosthetics, but tests under identical conditions produced no anomalies. It was as if the interference only recognized the emotional intensity of the scene, not the physical environment. The audio issues were even harder to explain. Several takes captured a faint, insect-like buzzing that was not present on set. The sound had no spatial characteristics, no echo, no distance, and did not match any frequency emitted by nearby machinery. When the buzzing appeared, it always aligned with moments in the script where Brundle confronted the loss of his humanity. On the effects stage, an entire roll of film fogged during development, but only along the edges. Lab technicians described it as a creeping exposure, something that looked less like chemical damage and more like a shadow slowly invading the frame. The negative was stored in a temperature-controlled vault, removed only once, and handled correctly. Cronenberg later remarked that the interference seemed to mirror the narrative, as if the story of transformation had seeped into the equipment. Whether coincidence or something stranger, The Fly became a production where the boundaries between fiction and physical reality briefly, disturbingly blurred. 12. Westworld, 1973. The production of Westworld is often remembered for its groundbreaking use of early digital imagery, but few people outside the crew know how unstable the shoot became whenever the cameras rolled on the android malfunction scenes. Michael Crichton wanted realism, and he got it, but in ways no one on set expected. During multiple takes, the robotic point-of-view shots, filmed with an experimental digital sensor, refused to process correctly. The sensor generated patterns of pixel drift, thin diagonal streaks that resembled corrupted circuitry, yet the device was brand new, calibrated directly by the lab, and tested flawlessly hours earlier. What unsettled the technicians was the timing. These glitches manifested only when shooting sequences where the androids were breaking free of their programming. Tests conducted between takes produced clean results. As soon as actors resumed those dialogue lines, anything referencing autonomy, breakdown, or rebellion, the interference returned as if cued. The audio department faced similar issues. The shotgun microphones picked up rhythmic pulses during otherwise silent moments, a series of thumps spaced too evenly to be environmental noise. When slowed down, the pulses resembled a synthetic heartbeat, an artifact no one could trace to the soundstage equipment. Even stranger were the playback inconsistencies. After filming wrapped, certain reels appeared darker whenever the gunslinger character entered frame, almost as if the exposure dipped to mimic his inhuman presence. But exposure settings were locked manually. They should not have fluctuated at all. Kodak's lab confirmed the negative hadn't been chemically compromised, and no one could recreate the effect under controlled testing. Crichton, a pragmatic thinker, dismissed paranormal theories. Yet he admitted later that Westworld seemed sensitive, not in a metaphorical sense, but in the way the equipment reacted to the themes of control and uprising built into the script. The result wasn't just a film about technology going rogue. At times, it felt as if the film itself were struggling against the boundaries set for it. 13. The Andromeda Strain, 1971. On the surface, The Andromeda Strain was one of the most technically disciplined sci-fi productions of its decade. Yet beneath that veneer of scientific rigor lay a series of anomalies that the crew quietly referred to as the wildfire glitches. The film's distinctive multi-screen sequences required a synchronized system of cameras and monitors, cutting-edge technology for 1971, and it was during these shots that the unexplained failures began. The monitors would sometimes flicker in perfect unison, not randomly, but in a pattern resembling Morse code. Engineers reviewed the power supply, grounding, and signal routing and found nothing irregular. When they attempted to record the flicker intentionally, it stopped. When they resumed shooting, it returned. Even stranger were the incidents involving the cleanroom set. At least 3 times, the cameras captured brief, translucent shapes drifting through the sterile environment, shapes that didn't correspond to reflections, lens flares, or crew movement. The shapes were irregular, almost biological in outline, and appeared only for a fraction of a second. Technicians dismissed them as emulsion defects until a lab report noted that the anomalies existed only in duplicate reels, not in the original negative. Sound recording proved no less troubling. Several takes contained bursts of high-frequency tones outside the range of human speech, resembling data transmission signals. These tones occurred exclusively during scenes where characters discussed contamination, mutation, or unknown pathogens. Director Robert Wise reportedly grew irritated with the constant malfunctions, but later admitted in an interview, "Some films fight back. This one felt like it was trying to warn us not to keep going." To this day, archivists can't replicate the glitches under controlled conditions. The interference remains embedded like a microscopic organism, quiet, persistent, and impossible to fully explain. 14. Stalker, 1979. The production of Stalker is already legendary for its troubled history, but the technical failures during filming remain among its most enigmatic aspects. Shot in abandoned industrial zones filled with decaying machinery, stagnant water, and unstable magnetic fields, Stalker became a textbook case of unexplained interference. Cinematographer Alexander Knyazinski noted that entire segments of footage turned a sickly green after development, not because of chemical errors, but due to an unknown energy exposure that Kodak technicians later admitted they could not identify. Some shots simply refused to stay in focus, no matter how carefully the lenses were calibrated. The autofocus indicators, rudimentary but reliable for the time, drifted as if being pulled by an invisible gravitational source. When the crew attempted to reshoot these scenes, the interference repeated precisely at the same camera angles, even though lighting, weather, and equipment had changed. Most disturbing were the audio anomalies. During quiet moments, especially scenes inside tunnels or derelict power plants, boom mics recorded low oscillations, resembling a distant turbine. Yet nothing in the environment produced such frequencies. When reviewed on set, the sounds were absent. When played back in the lab, they reappeared. Crew members spoke privately about the locations possessing a kind of pressure, an atmosphere that resisted documentation. Tarkovsky dismissed supernatural explanations, but admitted the zone had moods, and the film seemed to record them against its own will. In the decades since, archivists have examined the surviving negatives and agree on one point. Stalker contains patterns of interference that defy the predictable physics of film decay. Whatever happened on location left an imprint, one that feels less like an error and more like a warning. 15. Solaris, 1972. There's a particular unease that surrounds the production of Solaris, one that even the crew struggled to explain decades later. Tarkovsky's film was already a psychological labyrinth, but the strange events that unfolded behind the camera gave the production a second, more unsettling narrative. Operators began noticing that certain reels developed distortions only during scenes involving the ocean, not the practical tank on set, but the fictional sentient ocean in the script. These distortions weren't scratches or exposure errors. They were pulses, thin waves of brightness traveling across the frame like a heartbeat, then vanishing when the camera moved to a more ordinary scene. Sound technicians reported faint murmurs on the magnetic tape, not voices, not static, more like a rhythmic modulation drifting between frequencies, as if the tape were picking up a signal from a source far outside the studio's shielding. Engineers blamed Soviet-era wiring, yet those same lines handled dozens of productions without issue. Only Solaris pushed them beyond their limits. One assistant recalled that during a late-night shoot, the camera's internal light meter began shifting on its own, despite the lens caps still being on. The reading fluctuated as if responding to some external brightness in a sealed room. Tarkovsky, famously superstitious about the emotional resonance of environments, instructed the crew not to discuss the incident. "The film has its own consciousness," he said, "and it reacts when we approach its truth. Whether the anomalies were coincidences, environmental artifacts, or something stranger, they left a lingering impression." Solaris didn't just depict an intelligent ocean. At times, it felt like it was being observed by one. Bonus fact: The Twilight Zone, Nightmare at 20,000 feet, 1963. What happened during the filming of Nightmare at 20,000 feet remains one of the strangest, least discussed cases of analog interference ever recorded in early television history. Rod Serling's anthology was already known for eerie coincidences, but this episode centered on a man who sees a creature outside an airplane window was plagued by technical disturbances, so specific, so thematically aligned, that even the studio's senior engineers admitted they had no explanation. The airplane set was built on a hydraulic gimbal, lined with painted windows and fog machines, yet during the creature reveal sequences, the window glass repeatedly fogged from the inside, despite the interior temperature being tightly controlled. The phenomenon didn't occur during rehearsals. Only when cameras rolled on the shots featuring the creature did a thin, hand-shaped smear appear on the pane, as if something had pushed against it from the opposite side of the set. The crew wiped it clean. Minutes later, the shape reappeared. Lighting proved even more perplexing. The episode's storm effects were created with strobes and rotating filters, but cinematographers noticed subtle exposure fluctuations that occurred only during close-ups of William Shatner's character reacting to the creature. These fluctuations weren't random. They pulsed in steady intervals, like a coded sequence, then stopped instantly when the creature left the frame. When analyzed frame by frame, the fluctuations formed faint bands of increased grain density, something Kodak's lab technicians could not reproduce with artificial testing. Audio anomalies heightened the disquiet. Throughout filming, boom microphones recorded a low-frequency rumble that resembled turbulent wind, except the soundstage was acoustically sealed. The rumble disappeared on playback machines but reappeared when the footage was transferred to master reels. Some engineers believed it was electrical interference from the gimbal motor. Others insisted no such frequency existed in the machinery. What makes the case truly haunting is a detail buried in a production memo. The interference occurred only in moments when the script depicted something no one else could see. Writer Richard Matheson reportedly joked, "Maybe the gremlin didn't like being filmed." But decades later, archivists reviewing the surviving negatives noted the same faint tremors in exposure and grain signatures of an invisible presence. The equipment seemed to register on instinct. Some episodes disturb audiences. This one disturbed the film itself. The deeper these case files go, the more one truth becomes impossible to ignore. None of these disturbances behaved like ordinary malfunctions. They appeared with intention, surfacing in scenes that pushed too close to the unknown, fading the moment the narrative pulled back. Whether the cause was environmental, electromagnetic, or something far less tangible, the interference left behind a signature that still clings to the reels decades later. So the question is yours now. Were these glitches simply the limits of old machinery? Or did the machinery momentarily capture something we weren't meant to see? Which explanation do you believe? And which one feels too close to the truth?